NFL Week 7 on tap. Here to break it down, betting expert Billy. A lot of you may know him from his contributions with props on the Bet the Board podcast. You can follow him on the platform formerly known as Twitter at Watt_05. Billy, appreciate you joining the show. Welcome to Props and Hops.
Hey, happy to be on. I got to do some digging into the podcast. It looks like you've had some great guests, and I'm happy to just join and talk some football.
Absolutely. And to the audience that has joined as well, want to thank you. If you're with us live across Twitter or YouTube, feel free to jump in the chat with any thoughts or questions, and I'll look to weave that into the show where possible. Billy, to get the ball rolling here, as a first-time guest on the show, excited to welcome you to the pretty illustrious fraternity of guests. It's always so humbling to think about what has built up here over the years. But I love to start when bringing somebody on for the first time, just getting a sense of their background in betting. So go ahead and walk us through that from your experience.
Yeah, so growing up, I grew in a household. I have a big family, and we have some members of our family who love to, they were not, I would say, gamblers to the sense where they were betting the point spreads, but they always were aware of everything going on. And I used to run like pick'em football pools when I was 9 and 10 years old for everyone. And as I got older and I got more into math, and I really enjoyed math throughout school, I realized that my two passions were math and sports. And about halfway through college, I just realized that there was another avenue for me if I wanted to put in the work. And I'll never forget, I had a moment where I kind of had a fork in the road, and I was working another job, and I was betting on a Sunday, and I was betting about $33 a bet. And I went 1-17 betting NFL sides and totals that day. And I remember I was probably 20 years old, and it was devastating. I remember the pit in my stomach. I felt like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I have no idea. I just lost all this money. And I remember saying, I need to either go all in and try and figure this out, or I need to stop doing it. And I chose the go all in route. And about 4 or 5 years later, I left my job in retail and took the plunge into professional sports betting. I got hooked up with the Bet the Board guys. I've known Payne for quite some time. He was kind of a mentor to me throughout the process of me becoming a professional. He gave me some great insight on the business and what you don't always see. He advised me that it wasn't very glamorous, as people like to assume it is, and it was a ton of work. But he instilled a lot of confidence in me that I could do it. So I took that plunge went full time in about 2017. I was severely undercapitalized. I kind of just jumped in. No one was staking me. I used my own money, and I just built it. And we're here now, and I've had some success. So now I do this as all I do for a living. It's been all I'm doing for a living since 2017.
That sounds like quite the accomplishment, and I know the journey in some ways is probably just beginning. So over the course of this conversation, excited to learn more about your background and how it applies to some of your viewpoints, whether it's the current week's betting board or some process-driven stuff we'll get to a bit later on. But Billy, if we want to go ahead and shift our sights to the Week 7 betting board, always like to start with props on this show, hence the name, and I know that's in your wheelhouse as well. So for starters, is there anything you're eyeing as far as props are concerned for Week 7 in the NFL?
Yeah, so normally the guys I work with and like our prop group, we don't usually bet till game day for most of the games. We might have a couple the day before, but there's plenty of prop groups out there who like to go early. They'll go on a Wednesday, Thursday, whenever the legal's open. They have great networks, and they can get down good money at very soft prices, and props to them. It's just not the way we normally do things. There is one, though, for tomorrow. I was eyeing, and actually we're betting this. We might have just bet it just now, but we're looking at Troy Franklin. We actually like his over long reception tomorrow in the Denver-New Orleans game. New Orleans has just been pitiful in yards after catch allowed. I think they're worst in the league in that. And since Josh Reynolds went down with an injury, Troy Franklin's been getting a ton of routes. We saw he ran 25 against the Chargers. So we went over 12.5 on his long reception, especially Sean Payton going back into the building. We think he's going to have some interesting plays to surprise that defense. So that's one we went on already. But for Sunday's board, we normally won't be betting any of that till Friday at the very earliest.
Got it. Well, appreciate the early look at Franklin longest reception over 12.5 as far as tomorrow night's game goes between the Broncos and the Saints. And a lot of props are offered at a relatively flat, if you will, -115. Is there a price point at which you might say, okay, it's bettable up to this VIG threshold?
Yep. So I would play that 12.5 is good to -125. But I would also play the 13.5s out there at -110, -115. Those are good. Those are good as well.
Got it. Appreciate the context there. And to your point about often eyeing game day props, again, the pick off the top is great, but I am excited more than anything to dive into process with you. When you talk about focusing on game day, on one hand, I was a bit surprised to hear that because books seem to be posting props earlier than ever, and you can often beat others to the punch by firing early, to your point, getting in at some soft numbers. On the other hand, it could make all the sense in the world because availability and limits tend to be much better closer to kickoff. So describe your thought process when it comes to how you determine when to pull the trigger and when to hold off.
Yeah. So most of my work isn't done by Wednesday or Thursday. I'm waiting for the latest injury reports, especially when it concerns the props. So I originate all the props we bet, and I'm also originating my numbers for sides and totals too. I'm putting a full handicap on the game, and that takes time. And you mentioned the limits. That's a big deal when you're trying to bet on Wednesday or Thursday. Some of these groups have excellent networks, but some of them also, we see folks who sell these plays, right? Sell props. They sell prop packages. They'll put them out on Wednesday or Thursday, and their followers will oversteam them. They will move so much in the other direction, in the direction of their prop, that it provides value on the other side. The one other aspect to get betting game day is the credit shops. And a lot of the credit shops aren't opening until game day unless there's Prop Builder, which I don't know if your audience is familiar with Prop Builder, but it is one of the biggest prop tools on any of these credit shops or PPHs. And those are usually up Wednesday, Thursday. But for most of the other skins, we'll call them the PPHs, they're not doing it till game day, and that's when we can get the most down. At sometimes these you get a better price on game day. Even on some of the stuff that steams, it can come right back. So I don't ever worry too much about missing a number. If I miss a number, I let it go. But there's a huge benefit these days also to a lot of the legal sites are offering live player props. And if you miss a number and maybe there's an opening drive and the player you're targeting, whether it's over or under, has a play in the direction opposite of what you wanted to bet, well, you may be able to get a better number. And obviously you got to factor in the time lost, but there's a lot of opportunity there in live wagering too with the player props.
I'll circle back with you on potential buyback opportunities when a number gets steamed perhaps too far later on in this conversation. But pursuant to this most recent point you've made about live props and the opportunities that can create, I'm taken back to a few years ago when I read The Logic of Sports Betting, and I cannot recommend that highly enough for anybody who's maybe a beginner or intermediate bettor looking to level up their game. Yes, it's Logic of Sports Betting by Ed Miller and Matthew Davidow. And one of the concepts that really hit home with me while reading that book was live lines, at least in more efficient markets like sides and totals, will often take into account what's happened in the game so far. It's common for people to say, well, let's take the Raiders. They got steamed earlier today. The +7s are pretty much cleaned out at the Rams. Now a lot of +6.5s are out there. And if somebody missed the +7, they might say, oh, well, I'll just wait. Maybe the Rams score first and I can get an even better number on the Raiders in game. The problem is that if you're getting a better number on the Raiders, it's because of something that has already transpired in the game.
Yep.
So when it comes to props, am I onto something thinking the same concept could apply, or does perhaps market inefficiency with props relative to sides and totals make that still a more advantageous look when you're talking live prop betting?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the market inefficiency. Obviously, these traders are putting a ton of time into full game sides and totals and what's going on in the game. But there are plenty of opportunities if a player or a team is down early, down in the first half, and you're seeing some of these wide receiver props are being adjusted a little bit too low and it's not factoring in the game state as much. I've seen that plenty of times. I'm not going to mention the platforms that are doing this, but they're platforms that everyone has access to. So I would say you're right. You don't want to just jump in. It's never a good idea to just jump in and say, oh, the first quarter's done, and my player that I wanted to bet over 30 receiving yards, has zero receiving yards. Now he's at 20. I should just bet the over 20. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. If you're factoring in, though, if you're seeing his usage rates, if you're seeing how the game's playing out, is he open? Is there abilities for him later in the game? That's something you should consider. It's definitely going to be less efficient than a full game side or total market.
All right, and I hear you on that being game state specific. So I'm going to pivot just a bit here and throw something at you that isn't so game state specific, more of a math-based game prop. And for me, this one has been a meal ticket, taking shortest touchdown yardage in a Detroit Lions game. I'm looking at Detroit, Minnesota, shortest touchdown under 1.5 yards. And one thing I often look for here is the total of a game. We're looking at a total of 50 between the Lions and Vikings. That's the third highest on the board. It's crazy this year. I feel like 50 would be the highest on the board most weeks to date, but third highest on the week 7 slate, a high total of 50 nevertheless. And when we're thinking that a game will likely see a lot of points, that's good for the prospects of a lot of touchdowns, and by extension, at least one 1-yard touchdown. And for a lot of listeners who haven't heard me break this down previously, I'll note that 1-yard touchdowns are a lot more common than a lot of fans might guess. Something like pass interference in the end zone gets the ball placed at the 1, and the field just has a way of getting compressed near the goal line. I've noticed over the years as well, anytime the ball's inside the 2, if there is any daylight between the ball and the 2-yard line, this is often graded as a 1-yard touchdown.
Yep.
Getting into the matchup as well, for the Lions, David Montgomery has been a cash cow behind a stout offensive line getting this home. Dan Campbell's aggression on 4th down, also a benefit here. I think a lot of drives that would end for most teams with a kick are more likely to see a snap from the 1 for a team like Detroit. On the Minnesota side of things, not quite as bullish, but Detroit's front is a little bit less imposing now that they've lost Aiden Hutchinson. And for both teams here, we've got elite play callers in Ben Johnson and Kevin O'Connell. Of course, all this boils down to the price. This will become more widely available at a lot of books closer to kickoff. But today I've seen BetOnline hanging -150, DraftKings in the regulated market at -154. A bit of wiggle room in my book. I make this good up to -160. I know that can sound like a lot of vig, but I think we see at least one 1-yard touchdown in this matchup 2/3 of the time. That equates to -200, a 66.7% break-even probability. And if we're looking at a price of -160 or better, that's just a 61.5% break-even probability. Add up a lot of math in here, but to me, it's an edge worth playing. Billy, any thoughts on shortest touchdown under 1.5, good up to -160 in Detroit, Minnesota?
Yeah, you mentioned the most important thing with this specific type of prop, and that's price, because the prices on these short touchdowns can be varied all over the place. Whether you're looking at a very low total and going over 1.5, or a very high total, which we have in this game, going under 1.5. I also think you didn't mention this point, but Detroit's cornerbacks have been extremely handsy and been called for a ton of pass interference penalties, especially Terrion Arnold. It's going to be interesting. Carlton Davis, the same thing. So Minnesota has plenty of weapons in that end zone. You could see Detroit as well maybe get called for a pass interference down there. You mentioned a great point about where they spot the ball. I have been on the other end of those where I've bet over 1.5 yards in totals of 35 and 34. And I'm seeing the ball spot like basically at the 2. And then the ball's run in and I'm going, oh, that's a 2-yard touchdown. And then you see it's graded as a 1-yard touchdown. You're like, oh my gosh. So you're getting some wiggle room there. Yeah, I like that play. I wouldn't probably play more than -160, but I think good up to 160 is good.
All right, glad to see some alignment with the props when it comes to somebody with your expertise on the show. So we're off to a good start. We'll see how that might extend into some other markets. Billy, if we want to look at sides, totals, teasers, derivatives, futures, anything that may stand out to you, where would you say you're currently seeing the most value on the betting board beyond the prop that you shared earlier for the Thursday night game?
Yeah, so I'll share something we played this morning, and we played their playoff price before last week as well, and that's the Cincinnati Bengals in the regular season win total market. We went over 8.5 at -111. I would play this good to -130, which is very available out there. When you look at the Bengals, obviously they've had a tough start in the win-loss column, but the offense is honestly playing phenomenal. Like Joe Burrow looks great. He's second in completion percentage over expectation and EPA blend. They got a great back in Chase Brown. T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are healthy. Eric All Jr. is starting to become that tight end that they're really looking for. I really like them in the trenches too, especially that defensive line's getting a lot healthier. I think with this game against Cleveland, if they can get by this game, which divisional games are very tough, even with everything going on in Cleveland, Amari Cooper's out. It seems like things are in disarray. They can still be very tough games, especially Schwartz usually comes up with a good game plan against the Bengals. But if they can get by this game, they have the Eagles at home, Las Vegas at home, and then they go in their bye week. If Cincy can win 2 of those 3 games, I think they're in a really good position down the stretch to go over 8.5. The AFC is also, it's very wide open in terms of playoff race. No one is really separating themselves when you look at all these teams. So we took plus 120. There's plus 115s out there on them to make the playoffs. I'm betting on Joe Burrow and this Bengals defense to get it together. We saw signs of life from them against the Giants on Sunday night, kind of a renewed effort. And the other thing I like about this team is they're really never satisfied. And if you listen to the quotes after the game, even Jamar Chase was like, "This is not the way we play." Even after a win, he's like, "This is not who we are. We need to be more explosive." He acknowledged that he made some mistakes. This is a championship caliber mindset team with the talent to do so. So I'm in on their over 8.5, especially when we're seeing what's going on inside the division with Cleveland kind of falling off pretty quickly. Pittsburgh looks like they're going to be moving to Russell Wilson, but they've kind of been living and dying with that defense for many years. We'll see what comes on with them later in the year, but I like the Bengals over 8.5 still on the regular season win total.
And one thing I didn't hear you say, but that might fuel that handicap a bit further, would be something I struggle to quantify, but I'll often think about a team's record year to date in a market like this. The Bengals at 2-4 could easily be 3-3 or 4-2. Thinking about the last second loss to the Chiefs, the way they lost to Baltimore a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And I think if Cincinnati were 3-3 or 4-2, what would this number be? Obviously, the number would be higher, accounting for the wins that are already banked. But I think that just because their record is 2-4 doesn't mean they're lacking the pedigree and the talent on hand of a winning team. So to your point, I think some of those tough losses early might be suppressing the regular season win total we're seeing for the rest of the season. You're probably closer to markets like this than I am, regular season win totals in the middle of the season. Does that logic track for how these often get priced and how you can therefore, as a better, find mispricings?
Yes, I think I don't want to give too much away here. I think there's plenty of opportunity in those markets. You see teams, I'll give one. I mean, the number's gone, obviously, and it should be gone. But Carolina, after their first 2 games, it was like, is this team going to win a football game, right? They looked horrific. Everyone was really out on this team. They make the switch to Dalton, and they win against Vegas. And their regular season win total went right back up past what it closed at preseason. It was as high as 5.5, and the under was minus 102, 103. And it was off of a win against Las Vegas Raiders, and they were 1-2 at the time. They still had a tough schedule coming up when, we found some value in under 5.5 there. Obviously, there were some sharp groups before the season who played their over 4.5. I looked at that side. I thought it was a good side, but you got to make adjustments based on what you're seeing. And that unfortunately for that team, the injuries in the trenches on the defensive side have just been devastating. And it just doesn't get any easier, especially when you look at that division. You look at Tampa Bay and the way they're moving the ball in offense. Atlanta's kind of clicking. The Saints have come through a tough stretch, but they already played them once. So Carolina's got some tough games ahead. But to your point about those markets, I think there's plenty of opportunity there, and the limits aren't too bad. So you can get down a good piece on those.
It can probably be a bit tougher to find really solid opportunity in efficient markets such as sides and totals. But Billy, I've got one of each that I'll run by you. Then I think we can probably have a pretty robust teaser conversation given this week's card. But starting with a side here, I like Seattle +3 at Atlanta, minus 115. Hat tip here to Hitman, who made this his best bet on today's Forward Progress Pick Show, as well as Cleve TA, who wrote this one up over at cleveanalytics.com. I've said oftentimes in the past, I'm not much of an originator myself, but when it comes to aggregating and curating others' opinions, Hitman and TA, 2 of the people I respect the most in the space, and a couple of common handicapping points they shared. In the past few weeks, Atlanta was a shorter favorite, laying less than a field goal, hosting New Orleans in Tampa Bay, and Seattle rates very closely in their eyes to those teams, at least where they were, the Saints and Bucks, when those games were kicking off in Atlanta. And if we look at right now, Seattle rated very closely to the Falcons, so this is giving Atlanta perhaps quite a bit of home field advantage. Just like we talked about Cincinnati having a misleading record so far, I think you could also make a pretty strong argument Atlanta at 4-2 has a misleading record. 3 very fortunate wins looking at their games against the Eagles, Saints, and the Bucks. On the Seahawks side of things, can't ignore the fact the defense has been struggling, but they have extra rest in this one coming off Thursday Night Football last week and some reinforcements on the way, led by defensive tackle Byron Murphy. On the other side of the ball, Seattle's weakness is its offensive line, but Atlanta gives them an ideal matchup because the Falcons bring basically no pass rush to exploit that weakness. So, Billy, all in all, what's your point of view on a potential look at Seattle +3 at Atlanta, laying -115?
Yeah, it's Seattle or pass here. I think all the points you brought up were great. I think when we look at Atlanta, obviously it seems like the offense is clicking, and it is, especially that run offense with Algier and Robinson. But that defense is struggling. And we saw Andy Dalton he made some big mistakes late in that game, but they were moving the ball with ease on the ground and through the air. Geno is he's very good in domes. I think maybe it was Cleve TA. Someone posted something about his EPA in domes. He's a very good dome quarterback. And you mentioned about the lack of pressure Atlanta gets. It's just nothing. And Seattle's got some studs on the wide receiver, in the wide receiver core. So I like Seattle. I like the extra rest. Obviously, we would love to get back some of those defensive pieces. These were two teams also that I was higher on Seattle coming into the season. We went over 7.5 regular season wins. In season, we went under 9.5 for Atlanta. That one's not looking so great with some of these fortunate wins, but I think you're spot on. It's +3 or pass, and 315 is probably pretty good there. I think that number is going to close 2.5. I don't see that number staying at 3.
All right, we'll see if this total I'm going to throw your way has any more room to move. As a caveat, totals, not my wheelhouse, but when multiple bettors I respect who take different approaches to reach the same conclusion, that resonates with me. And that's what I've seen with Carolina, Washington, current number 52. So it's moved a bit, but let's still call it what it is at the moment. Carolina, Washington over 52. Rob Pizzola made this his best bet on forward progress. Cleve TA also on this one. Worth noting, they released 51.5, hence some of the line movement that we've seen with that tick up to 52. So maybe 52 warrants a reduced wager amount, but I still think there might be some wiggle room here. A couple of key points Rob made. The Carolina front seven defensively, absolutely decimated. He said his floor for Washington's team total is in the low 30s. And then if you flip it around, Washington's defensive front seven, losing Jonathan Allen, he thinks Carolina's going to be able to move the ball as well in this one. TA shared some similar points, also noting at this time of year, important to start monitoring weather, but the forecast looks pristine in Washington. Overall, we've got 2 abysmal defenses, 1 elite offense thus far in Washington, and 1 offense that could at least be competent in this setting in Carolina. All in all, Billy, any thoughts on Carolina, Washington over the high number of 52?
It's not for me, but it's not for any of the reasons you mentioned. The only reason at a price point that high is I think both of these teams can have success on the ground, and especially Carolina. I think we're going to see them run the football, especially with the interior of Washington's defensive line so banged up. They can throw it too on this Washington secondary. You need very good red zone efficiency in this game. You're going to need Carolina to put together touchdowns and not field goals. So, because I think the clock's going to be ticking a lot. I think you're going to see a lot of completions. I think you're going to see chunks 5-6 yards on the ground. And so that's going to take the clock down. If you're getting red zone, if you're getting teams going 60% in the red zone, this should be fine. You're going to get over this total. That's my only concern when you're getting up in the 50s. But in general, you made a good point. Like, where are the stops? I mean, who's getting stops here? How's Carolina stopping Washington on the ground, at least? I mean, Jaden Daniels and this passing offense is really starting to go too. But yeah, I don't see too many stops here. I guess the only thing you're hoping for is you're not getting in situations where it's a 4th and 2 or a 4th and 1 and teams go for it and they fail and down in the red zone. That's the only way I see this really getting stopped. 52 is getting up there, but again, it would be over a pass ring. I definitely don't want to stand in front of this under.
All right, so we'll chalk it up as a neutral response to the total, but some good alignment on the side with Seattle on the prop Lions-Vikings shortest touchdown under 1.5 at -160 or less, and you can find better vig out there on that prop right now. Let's see how this plays out when we talk teasers this week. It is quite the juicy Week 7 card for those inclined to bet teasers, and that's even after a bloodbath the first month of the season.
And bad,
Fortunately, I took a break for the most part and dodged some bullets.
and bad.
But at this stage of the season, the market's more efficient than it was in September. That gives us a higher degree of certainty on the quality of each team. That tends to bode well for teasers, which are essentially bets against variance. So, Billy, I guess before we dive into the weeds on week 7, how would you describe your general point of view on teasers?
In line with most of the sharp guys, right? We play the long teasers as long as certain totals are within a certain range, and the juice on the 2.5s aren't leaning toward. If it's leaning towards 3, we tend to stay away. I am fortunate enough where I have plenty of very good teaser books with great teaser odds, so I can 6-point minus 110 is very attainable for all the stuff we're betting. But you're right; it's been a bloodbath on those standard long teasers this year. But in general, if I feel like a teaser's a worthy play of a favorite going from 7.5 to 1.5, or a dog going up from 1.5 or 2.5 to 7.5, 8.5, I will definitely pull the trigger. I'm pro teaser.
All right, well, that gives us plenty of options to look into this week, as we've alluded to. I'll rattle off a handful I like in rotation order and certainly want to get your thoughts as well. First up, as I work top to bottom on the screen, would be Detroit plus 7.5 at Minnesota. No surprise to me if Detroit wins outright. I like the cushion of a potential 7-point loss. And a recent pattern I've noticed for the Vikings, they've been jumping out really fast on teams, but then letting them back into games. We saw that week 4 at Green Bay, then week 5 against the Jets in London. I'm not sure if that means anything, but if it does, kind of a free roll that the Lions could be more than capable of playing from behind in this one. A potential fly in the ointment here could be Minnesota money entering the marketplace if we get good news on Aaron Jones and TJ Hawkinson playing. But reports today not looking good for Hawkinson and very tenuous for Jones. So in favor right now, they'll look toward the Lions, teased up 6 points to plus 7.5 at Minnesota. I'll be quick on a few more of these. Washington down to -2, hosting Carolina. Basically just the clearly superior team at home, needing to do little more than win outright. Also liking Kansas City in the Super Bowl rematch, plus 7.5 at San Francisco, where the spread isn't currently Niners -1. We've got two narratives on steroids here. Patrick Mahomes is an underdog and Andy Reid off the bye. I give these narratives, like most, little weight, if any, but they certainly don't hurt the case here. And when we've got a chance to take the best team in the league with the best quarterback, arguably the best coach, just to stay within a touchdown, I like it. I'm not going to be surprised if the Chiefs win this one outright. Two more as we hit the home stretch here. Pittsburgh +8 hosting the Jets on Sunday night. The Jets add Devontae Adams, but they're on the road on a short week. Kind of wonder if the wrong team's favored here. I really feel confident in Pittsburgh's defense, keeping this one within striking distance if the Steelers can't pull out the outright victory. A slight risk here is the quarterback change to Russell Wilson. That does introduce a little bit of unwanted variance, I would say, for this equation. And then on Monday Night Football, the second game of the doubleheader, Arizona +8.5 hosting the Chargers. Judah Fortgang on forward progress made, I thought, a pretty salient point in that the Chargers defense could be inflated by some pretty weak opposition so far outside of that week 4 Kansas City matchup, especially looking at who the Chargers have taken on against the run, on which the Cardinals offense will likely rely. And on the other side of the ball, the Chargers tend to be run heavy. That can shorten the game, and that can reduce the odds of the Chargers winning by multiple scores. So let's say my top choice as of our recording Wednesday, late afternoon Pacific time, Detroit +7.5 at Minnesota, paired with Kansas City +7.5 at San Francisco, where you can get two team 6-point teasers at -120 or better. Billy, I'm going to take a breath, toss it over to you for your approach on this wild week 7 teaser opportunity.
Yeah, so we've gotten ahead. We've played a couple. We got a good number on the Bills before it went to 9 and 9.5. We paired that with Arizona. I see Circa's dealing a 2 right now on Arizona, while some of the markets 2.5 or headed a little bit more towards 3. I like Arizona this week, and I like Buffalo under that 3. Detroit, Minnesota. Obviously, look, if Aaron Jones is not playing, I think Detroit makes a phenomenal teaser. One of the guys I work with, a partner of mine, another professional gambler, he loves Detroit this week. He's used them in teasers. He's taken them outright. So I do like Detroit. I'm a little concerned in that game, just what they look like without Hutchinson. Brian Flores scheming up some pressure for Goff. It concerns me a little bit. But look,
Sure.
this is a typical teaser. These are the teaser spots you got to play. If you're going to play teasers, you got to play Detroit. Kansas City, that's another one where my overall power rating number actually leans a little bit more towards San Francisco, but that's not factoring in everything off the bye. We can scoff at the narrative of Andy Reid off a bye, but it's a thing for real. That guy actually does very well off a bye, and Patrick Mahomes does very well as an underdog. We can pretend those things don't exist just because it's hard to quantify, but they do exist. So I think both of those are great teaser legs. These long teasers got to eventually turn around. I think those are two great pairings right there.
And when it comes to thinking outside the box on a week like this, a lot of people, if they hear teaser, they think 2 teams, 6 points, ideally for those who are price sensitive, get minus 120 or better. But looking at options such as a 3-team teaser plus 160 or better, a 4-team teaser plus 250 or better, or even a 5-team teaser plus 450 or better, all of these numbers I've just quoted tend to be more widely available than the minus 120 2-team teaser these days. And if you do the math, I'll spare you the need to do it yourself if you're listening to this. Those all represent better value than 2-teamers at minus 120, unless I've made a mistake that you can correct me on, Billy. So if we think about so many options this week and the ability to go beyond the standard 2-team 6-point teaser, how much thought do you ever give to either teasing teams outside the common framework of the Wong teasers, crossing those key numbers of 3 and 7, or going beyond 2 teams and perhaps taking more than 6 points in each leg?
I think it depends on the pricing. I'm fortunate enough to have some books who offer 7-point minus 120s, and which is, people are just behind at the wheel. So some of these credit shops, they're just not focused on teasers. They think teasers don't win long term, so they're willing to offer you some good prices. You mentioned the 3-team and 4-team prices. There are plenty of places out there that offer 4-team at plus 300. That's at 6 points. That is worth it if you're playing across the 3 and the 7. The 3 and the 7 is definitely worth it. And you mentioned if you're taking it at the minus 120 calculation, those are better prices at the 3-team plus 160, 4-team plus 250. I would, you got to have conviction. I wouldn't play those for normal, if you have conviction on 1 game or 2 games, playing those at whatever your standard unit size is, and then going in the 3-team, 4-team, lowering that unit size, lowering that bet size, and playing those. But if you can have a big weekend playing across those long teasers if they hit. It's been tough this year, but that's just variance. I think they're going to get figured out, especially folks to look for these lower total games. You see totals. You mentioned the Pittsburgh game. We use Pittsburgh in a teaser already. I've been higher on the Jets than most people. I think the Devontae Adams trade is going to work out for this team, but you mentioned maybe the wrong team is favored. It's a tough spot for New York. And the Russell Wilson stuff is definitely intimidating. It's a little scary seeing him get thrown under center with a brand new center this week against an interior Jets defensive line who's they got some dudes there that can cause some problems. But if you're looking at a total of 37.5, 38, and you can get that up through 8. I think that's a very good teaser leg.
One point I want to underscore, you shared something that reminded me of having Captain Jack Andrews on this show about the midpoint of last season, and he was walking us through some value he was seeing, of course, in Captain Jack fashion, using the unabated teaser tool. And he showed how there's some really good value on not just the 2-teamers, but if you can get the right number for 3 teams, 4 teams, 5 teams, yes, you can have an epic weekend if everything comes through. But of course, each leg you add means you need one more thing to go right for you. So just a bit of a word of caution when it comes to bankroll management, probably scaling back the staking. I think you touched on this and just wanted to underscore, just because I think a 5-team teaser at plus 450 offers more value than a 2-team teaser at minus 120 doesn't mean that I'm going to risk more on that 5-teamer. If anything, I think this is a point I've heard Steve Fezzik make over the years. Consider the overall swing in a bet you make. Let's say your standard teaser unit sizing is risking to $100 and you're laying minus 120. That is a $220 swing. So whether you're laying minus 120 or you're getting plus 450, if you can keep the overall outcome in the ballpark of that same $220 swing, that's a good way to protect yourself from getting out over your skis.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes complete sense. I think people see and hear the word value and it gets thrown around a lot. And they say, oh my gosh, I'm taking a 6-1 underdog in a boxing or MMA fight. And he really should only be plus 450. and they think that this is some giant edge, and they start it's more value here, so they start making bigger bets. And it's like you have to understand the odds of you winning that bet are still very slim, and so you have to weigh that up. The mental portion of sports betting can be a bear, and it's something that shouldn't be taken lightly. And when you're making these bets, you have to understand you're going to lose a lot. You're going to lose a lot, even when you're playing plus 160s, plus 180s, plus 250s on teasers. You're going to lose those more than you win them. So just make sure when you're staking your bet size, you understand that, just for more of the mental part of the game.
Yeah, it reminds me of another mantra from somebody I highly, highly respect in the space, the legendary Roxy Roxborough. He hands out pens at Bet Bash. If anybody sees him next year, I think they say, stay in action. And it's keeping that mindset of you might have an edge on something, you might really have value, but if it's a big plus price, be ready for that not to come home. Sometimes, even if you think you have value on a bet, it's still one that you should expect to lose. So I think the mantra stay in action says it all as far as that's concerned. And when it comes to staying in action and putting yourself in a better spot over the course of years of action, Billy, I'd like to continue with the focus of props here, but really dive deep into your process. And first off, I think of the notion of handicapping versus betting. I think it might have been Roxy who, when asked once about Billy Walters, said, is he the best handicapper ever? Maybe. Is he the best bettor ever? Without a doubt. Something to
Yep.
that effect. So that delineation there, kind of the process of identifying value compared to the process of getting down at the best odds for the desired amount. How do you look at that balance when it comes to handicapping versus betting?
Yeah, I think knowing your role in the betting ecosystem is very important. I work with guys who maybe don't originate or don't handicap many sports, if any at all, but they are phenomenal at networking. They're phenomenal at getting bets down, at resourcing, networking. They don't need to originate. That's not their job. For me, my job is more on the origination side. I'm originating, and I have plenty of outs, but a lot of what I do and a lot of success of mine comes from my partners. I have great partners who I can send out a play to and say, hey, this is what I'd like to get down on this. And they're like, yep, I gotcha. And within 5 minutes, that bet's placed. And be a lot tougher for me to do that. I'm trying to spend my time working on the math, working on the reading, coming up with the bets that we're going to bet. I can't be doing both of these jobs where I'm coming up with the bets and all that time, and then the time it takes to get a bet down, funding accounts. There's a lot that goes into betting it once you start betting at a little bit higher amounts. And I think Roxy's point to Billy was perfect. Like, I think Billy Walters would himself admit he wasn't the greatest handicapper or originator. He used other people's work, and then he was able to get down. He made the final decisions, but he used other people's talents, and then he was able to get down large amounts. That's what he was great at. I mean, obviously he's arguably the greatest bettor of all time, but if you read his book and he talked about it, he was phenomenal at getting a bet down. And I work with guys, and we kind of all know our roles. Like, my role is to originate bets, come up, do all the work, and it's very time intensive. It takes me a lot of time to go through all the stuff I'm doing and figure out what we're going to be betting. So I don't have the time to be setting up different accounts here and accounts there and dealing with the back end or agents or the money stuff. It's a big process, but I would say knowing your role, networking, and I'm very fortunate that I have amazing partners who help me out. Like, that's a huge part of my success.
When you spoke to originating, I heard you mention doing a lot of reading, applying a lot of math. What else goes into that process for you?
There's a lot of game theory. So reading is huge. Math is important, but I'm never going to be like an MIT math guy. So if I think my edge is going to come from building the best model, betting strictly off of that model, I'm going to go broke. That I can't win that way. I would never pretend like I could. So do I use math? Absolutely. I do have models I use, but those are complements to the other parts of the betting. So reading, game theory, and then getting honestly incredible information from different people in my space, people who I've known for years or come across tidbits of information, and they reach out to me and say, hey, this is what I heard. And being able to get down on that information pretty quick is vital to my success. So doing that, and then I would say something I've gotten into a lot more in the past 3 to 5 years is live betting. I would consider myself to be a pretty successful college basketball live better and NFL live better. And that just for me, comes with experience of watching these sports, understanding what coaches' tendencies are, players' tendency, how to evaluate injuries to a certain team. That's another big one that I think I excel in, especially in football, is pricing out certain players' injuries when they go down. Um, so that's kind of my role. That's how I approach handicapping and originating um, through that lens, is really just the game theory portion, plenty of reading, and obviously working on math stuff, models, averages, statistics, all that stuff.
As you mentioned, live betting, if you'll humor me for a quick post-mortem here, spoiler alert, this is a losing live bet that I placed this past weekend, and it was my first one of the season. I don't bet a ton live, but as a Chargers fan, I'm watching them take on the Broncos. Chargers' first series of the game, yes, Patrick Surtain goes down for Denver, but Jim Harbaugh mysteriously leaves the field. Quentin Johnston hobbles off the field. Ladd McConkey gets evaluated for a concussion. Jesse Minter, as the interim head coach for the Chargers, kicks a field goal on 4th and goal from the 2. At that point, I'm thinking, where are the points in this game going to come from? If Johnston and McConkey are out, if Harbaugh doesn't come back, and Minter is very conservative during his brief time as the head coach, I found an under 36.5. So Sean Payton's field goal in the end game did me no favors. But from a process-driven standpoint, I just felt like, okay, there's not time when you're live betting to get too calculated with it. So I just very quickly tried to cobble this together. Yes, an injury to Denver's best corner, but multiple injuries to an already weak Chargers wide receiving core. Coaching maybe even more conservative than the ground and pound attack we've seen from Harbaugh. So that leaned me toward the under. Overall, result aside, how does that process track with the way that you look to make live betting decisions on the spot?
Similar. I mean, it's really about making quick decisions and having conviction in what you're doing. And a lot of that for me comes from, I mentioned, the experience of just seeing these spots before, seeing how stuff gets priced when a quarterback goes down, or there's an uncertainty on an offensive line, or in college basketball, a team builds a big lead. How does this team normally play? Will they drain the clock? Like all that stuff you start factoring in, and it has to be done quickly. There's no denying that, and some of it's more of your gut. It's not like I'm not running a live math model on these games and going, okay, using some of these tools that are out there. And I've seen them. There's some great tools out there. I think the guys you mentioned from the Logic of Sports Betting, the Deck Prism that they've used has obviously been successful for them. I'm not doing that. A lot of what I've done is through experience and just understanding the flow of a game and making a quick decision and pulling the trigger. And usually, I'll have 4 or 5 different places to bet options open for myself, and obviously grabbing the best number. I mean, it's boring to talk about. But it's like that's the difference in 1 to 2% of your ROI over the course of the year is getting that great number on something. Getting a 46.5 when the market's at 47, like that's huge. It's huge. So that's a big part of it too, is just price shopping, being militant with that part of the betting process.
And I will note right now that if anybody's catching this conversation and they're interested in broadening their network, if you're looking for somebody to partner with and you've got some good accounts, please feel free to reach out to Billy. Again, that Twitter handle at Watt_05. Billy, when you spoke to origination earlier, you also mentioned that being your role in the space, but also having such a strong network. Beyond some of the standard networking tips people might hear in the betting space, how would you say that if we take it a level further, you've really seen it work wonders in your career up to this point so that you can focus on origination and know that you're in good hands when it comes to partners who can take care of a lot of the other bases?
That's a great question. I would say I was fortunate. I mean, I was very lucky. I was very lucky to grow up in a family that understood gambling and kind of knew people in the gambling space, as well as I had some childhood friends who just were involved in that space and kind of grew into it. And that has been one of the biggest advantages I've had is honestly having a great network and didn't have to work as hard as others do for that network. I'm not gonna sit here and say, I grinded away and got into people's Twitter DMs, and I didn't have to do that. I was very fortunate that some of the people I grew up with or knew about, we or lived near each other, kind of both grew up in the industry and both wanted to excel in the industry and just kind of leaned on each other. And advice I'd give to people who want to expand their network is I would say communicate. Communicate with people online. Some of the people on Twitter, ask questions, even if they seem dumb, and just see where you can help someone. That was one of the biggest things I did, was just offering my help. Hey, if you need anything from me, just let me know. If you need me to place a bet for you or whatever. And this was once I became very comfortable with these people. But just understanding that it's not just about you, and the value you can add to someone else is going to end up working its way back into your life in the betting space. So it's tough. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it's just the best agents in the world and the guys who can get you down big bets are just floating around at your local bar. That's not the way it works. But if you start really reaching out to people, and you have plenty of great people on your podcast, I saw, and I see plenty of very successful bettors on other podcasts, or they've done one or two, and they seem very open to have conversations about sports betting and just starting a dialogue. That would be the first step.
I like that point of getting the ball rolling with some form of proactive communication, and especially once you layered on that value component. It reminds me of, I think, the first time I had Hitman on this show. He talked about expanding your network by reaching out to people in a way that you could add value to them. And
Yep.
it doesn't have to be the most brilliant idea ever. Sometimes you might think, how could I add value? I'm new at this, or I'm just intermediate and I'm trying to team up with somebody who's a pro, or at the very least a seasoned expert in this space. But in this case, if somebody's hearing this and they have a relatively virgin Bovada account or Bet Online account, you can probably offer value to Billy, whether or not you know too much about betting beyond that. So thinking about starting conversations and making it that two-way street can really work wonders. And of course, when things get working really well, Billy, I think of something like account longevity. And I first reached out to you thinking about your prop betting expertise. Clearly, you have so much domain expertise beyond props specifically. But a couple of years ago, betting on props was probably the fastest way to get limited or banned by a book. And if you fast forward to 2024, props are increasingly popular among recreational bettors. So even if you're gambling with an edge, with a wink and a nod there to Richard Munchkin and Bob Dancer and their great podcast, if you're gambling with an edge, you're getting a longer leash on props these days. But still, if you win enough, your days are likely numbered nevertheless. So how would you describe your approach to capitalizing as much as possible on edges in the present, while also maintaining the ability to get down in the future?
That's a great question. There's two schools of thought here. There are people who get accounts and their opinion is churn them and burn them. We are trying to make as much money off that account as quick as possible. When we get kicked out, that's fine. We're going to take our money. We're going to move on. Now, I'm talking about in the legal space here. In the PPH world, in the off screen world, where there are bookies that they don't always pay you when you win. Hate to say it to you. They think they get cheated when you crush them with 4 or 5 props in a week, and that's all you put in the account. You have to understand that a lot of guys see that and they immediately think sharp action. Even if you don't win, you might go 0-6 on prop bets one week on a local bookie account, a credit shop account, I should say, and you lose X amount of dollars. The next week you go 4-2, and they go, nope, not taking your action anymore. I'll pay you out on your wins this week, but you end up taking a net loss on that account. With the legals, it's a little different. Each book, whether you're talking about a FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM, they all have their own individual tolerances for what they allow and how to keep your account alive. If you're just putting in 75 to 80% props into an account and you're winning at a good clip, you're gonna get limited. Your account's probably going to get burned. It's going to, you're going to be able to bet $200 or $300 on a prop, or maybe even less, depending on the book. There are ways to keep your accounts alive. Obviously, books love seeing same game parlays thrown in there. They don't always know when you have an edge on those same game parlays. I've seen plenty of the major books make mistakes when pricing some of these same game parlays. Not saying that it's a gold mine out there, but there's definitely situations where you can look dumb and have an edge. And I think if you can find a way to do that, or if you can find someone who knows how to do that, that's very advantageous to keeping your accounts alive. But to your point about account longevity, That's where networking is huge, because there are groups out there who can get a lot of legal accounts and get them very quickly, and they can replenish them very quickly. There are others who can't. There are other people who, if you're an individual bettor, and let's say you crush NFL props and you're just working by yourself, and in 4 weeks you might be out of accounts. You might have gone through the FanDuels, the Caesars, the MGMs, the DraftKings, the ESPNs, and now you're sitting there, you're week 5, you're going, I'm great at what I do, but I can't bet anywhere. And that's where networking and kind of managing those accounts, if you're in that situation and you don't have some big network of guys who can replenish accounts, or a big family who can help you get accounts, then you have to be much more careful than someone who can replenish accounts at a high rate. And so when I say more careful, I mean, if you talked about today, Matt, about Seattle +3. You heard Cleve TA gave it out. You heard Hitman gave it out. You yourself like the bet. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're wondering how you can keep your account longevity going, thinking about finding one of those legal sports books, placing that +3 on the Seattle side or money line, parlaying it with your favorite prop of the week, it comes across as a parlay. When they're grading that, it comes across as a parlay. So you might have a little edge on Seattle, and then you have your prop edge. Combining those to a parlay, as long as the pricing is not too far off, is a way. I don't think you should be doing this for 50% of your bets. But if you're just throwing this in as maybe 10% of your bets throughout the week, it looks a lot better than an account that's just peppering in advantage props that are moving, 20 and 30 cents, and the book comes at the end, and you're going 10 and 4 every single week. I mean, that account's going to get limited. There's not much you can do about that.
I like that idea of pairing, if you consider it to be a plus EV side with a plus EV prop, put them together in a parlay where books will take it, and instead of this showing up as a prop bet, it gets classified differently. So that's something I hadn't thought before. I'm really going to take that to heart and see where I can put that into practice myself. I guess, Billy, when we're talking the prop side of that equation as well, I also want to get your thoughts on the notion of vig versus value. Thinking back to just a couple of days ago, the Bet the Board Monday Night Football prop this week was posted via Twitter. Tyler Conklin under 3.5 receptions at -145. Spoiler alert, Conklin only targeted 3 times, 2 receptions, so this one cashed with room to spare. That said, -145 might seem quite expensive to bettors who are used to laying -110 or so on sides, or getting big plus money on SGPs that you touched on a moment ago. How would you describe your point of view on value and vig, perhaps where they overlap and also where they can diverge?
It just comes down to pricing. And that's a kind of a longer discussion. But for me, if I'm originating something, I know when my stop price is or my buy point is, what a price is good to. So if I can bet something and say I still have a 1 or 2% edge on it, I will keep betting it. But I'm not afraid if something's priced at -500 and I believe it should be -900. I am not afraid to lay the -500. I mean, we do that all the time for the NFL draft. There are a lot of, and even in the Super Bowl, there's plenty of stuff we bet in the Super Bowl that should be priced a lot higher than it is, and we're not afraid to lay that juice. Now, those are called bridge jumper bets for a reason, because certainly you're putting a lot at stake to win a little, and you have to be okay with the fact that those bets are going to lose at some point. You may be laying something at -600, and 9 out of 10 is great on that bet, but you're going to have the time that you're going to lose that bet. And how are you going to be able to handle that? Is it going to ruin your day? Is it going to ruin your week? So that's when it comes to vig versus value, so to speak. You have your price, what it should be priced at, and you have your whatever your bet is good to. That's what you should be playing it to. You shouldn't let that concern you too much. Now, if you're just playing 8-1 favorites constantly, that's a tough life to live, because the stress of each of those games going on is going to weigh on you, and you got to factor that in. You got to factor that into how your process. So, yeah, when it comes to stopping points, like the Conklin bet moved pretty quick. Gave it out at -145. I think it got to -160. I'll do a better job at putting, especially on Bet the Board. Sometimes I don't always put the stop points on there, which is important. But some of those props, especially the Bet the Board ones, I'm trying to give out stuff that I think has a pretty decent edge, with some wiggle room to play it 10 to 15 cents after it's moved, sometimes even 20 to 25. If it's we had one the other day that was, I think we played -175 and it was good to like -260. So,
Jeez.
yeah, it was a big edge, and fortunate for us it won. But having those stopping points is important. Otherwise, we mentioned it earlier in the program. You see some of these sharp groups, whether it's college basketball sides or totals or props that they give out, and these things are moving. They're way over moving, and their followers, because they're buying these picks. And I'm not here to talk about whether buying picks, selling picks. I'm not having that discussion. I think there's certainly times that it makes sense to do so, but they want to get their money's worth. And if they missed a number, some of them are still going to be pushing that no matter what. It's like, hey, I paid for this pick. Even if it moved 25 cents, I'm still betting it, because if it wins, it wins. If it loses, it loses. So we see stuff get out of whack all the time based on some of these releases. So just be price sensitive when you're betting. If I'm putting out Conklin at -3, 3.5 under -145, and it drops to 2.5 at +110, it's not the same bet. And don't bet it. Be okay passing it. Be okay. The edges aren't that big. So it's really a fine line between how much these lines are moving when people are giving out these prop bets or these college basketball sides or totals or whatever's going on there.
That last point you made really aligns with one of my mantras on this show. The biggest edge we have as bettors is the ability to pick and choose our spots. Books are posting sides, totals, money lines, oftentimes a lot of props and derivatives for every game on the board. When you can be selective, sometimes I would say much more often than not, the prudent thing to do for a line is to let it go and to just go ahead and pass. And sometimes that can be tough. Maybe it can spark a little bit of FOMO if somebody has
For sure
heard about the best of the number, but it's too late to do anything about it. So as you speak to those potential buyback opportunities, I'm reminded of hearing Adam Levitan of Establish the Run last week on the Circles Off podcast. And he acknowledged that ETR has so much market influence with props at times that buying back after a number steams can be a profitable way to go about it. I think other groups, as you've mentioned, college basketball a few times, doing that when Right Angle Sports releases something has been an angle that a lot of people have considered, if not acted upon aggressively over the years. Do you see any similar type of sentiment when you have bet the board props that move pretty aggressively, where if somebody sees that Conklin example, if it were to have gotten to, over 3.5 receptions at a massive plus number, or if it moved to 2.5 and the pricing were adjusted in a way that buyback could have been advantageous. I guess what I'm getting at is, how much do you see that with the stuff that you do on Bet the Board specifically?
I will never buy back on stuff I give out there personally. Do I think there at times stuff gets overmoved? Absolutely. I saw someone today who was very sharp, gave out a prop on a EuroLeague player prop. It's a very sharp guy. And that number moved within 10 seconds, like 55 cents. And then it moved a full point down. And we're talking about a rebound prop. And those are the points where it's like, I didn't even check to see if it won or lost. But the movement sometimes is so drastic that it definitely makes sense to play back. You mentioned ETR. Those are some of the guys I'm talking about. Obviously, they release early, and they have a huge following. And their initial bets are usually very good. There's no denying that. But there comes a point where things, even you said Adam came on and said that things overmove so much that it gets to the point of coming back. I don't think Bet the Board has done that with my props. I think we're still it's gotten to the point where you can't play it anymore. I've definitely seen that. I haven't seen the point yet where it's like, okay, it's time to come back. I think the closest we had a Barkley one that was over 17.5 receiving yards, and it closed like 23.5. And I remember at that point I was like, God, if this got to like 25, I'm showing value on the other side now. And again, I don't want to bet against it. It did eventually land 21, so it fell in that area. So if people are chasing at 22, you're just betting a bad number there. And that comes back to our point of letting stuff go. But to your point about Bet the Board, I haven't seen it move to the point where it's like, oh, this is outrageous, like a RAS college basketball total, where it's just like it's moving 4 or 5 points and they're winning at a 55% clip. And you start doing the math and you're like, okay, it makes sense to play back here. Nothing against those guys. That's just the pure math of what's going on.
I appreciate your answer to that question because I feel like I did a pretty poor job of asking it, but the
Oh,
insight you gave was really valuable. And it reminds me of the notion that, price sensitivity really can reign supreme. Not to beat a dead
yes.
horse or just to say it as a generality, but two concrete examples I can think of immediately. One, a couple of weeks ago, a very sharp prop better released Nico Collins under 78.5 receiving yards for Houston. He
I
has
saw
78 in the
that.
first quarter, injures his hamstring. I think it was on that long touchdown,
Yep.
and ends his day at 78. So literally the hook on 78.5 made all the difference. Or if you played it too late, you took under 77.5. That could turn a win into a loss. And also a game that Saquon Barkley was famously involved in earlier this season for not making perhaps the easiest reception of his career. On the other side of that one, the Atlanta comeback on Monday night, I think this was week 2.
Yep.
There was the same better had Drake London receiving yards over, I think the number was 56.5. And even with the miraculous final Falcons drive and London catching what proved to be the game-winning touchdown, he landed, if not within half a yard, within 1 or 2 yards of the number, if I recall correctly. So sometimes you can see when NFL point spreads are between 2.5 and 3.5, the importance of 3. That can be pretty easy to see. But hiding in plain sight, a lot of these props, even if numbers are in the mid 50s or the high 70s, even then the hook can make all the difference. So just want to underscore that when it comes to real examples and recent examples of that price sensitivity at times making all the difference.
Yeah, I'll give you this happened to me. It irked me quite a bit on Sunday, and I was talking to one of my partners on the phone today about it because we were laughing about it. But I bet while the game was going on, I bet David Montgomery over 80.5 rush yards in the second or first quarter of the Dallas game.
Mm.
And I sent it to him and I said, I'm betting this. And he went and he bet. And for some reason, between me sending the message and him receiving the message and betting it, I think Dallas had run 1 or 2 plays, or Detroit had, and the number went down to 79.5. So he's like, oh, I got 79.5, you got 80.5, whatever. I'm thinking, okay, great. And David Montgomery got to 80 rush yards with about 3 minutes left in the third quarter. And so he's pumped. He won his bet. And I'm sitting there, I'm going, I just need another rush. What? I'll get it. They're up 30 something. And then I saw that Detroit had backups in on defense. And I remember going, oh my God. I originated the bet, came up with the bet. I got the worst of the number compared to me and my partner. And I'm going to lose this. And sure enough, David Montgomery never stepped back in that game. He stayed at 80. And I was like, this is unbelievable. But you're right. That the hook, you mentioned the Saquon Barkley game. We had a good swing of about 3 or 4 positions based on him dropping that ball with some Atlanta overs on the other side. So, as much as I'll, bitch and complain about Montgomery, there's also times where it works out for you where one play can have an impact on 3 or 4 bets. And I remember that Barkley play, and it had a positive impact for us on 3 or 4 bets on the Atlanta side.
And that exact sentiment, trying to appreciate the good breaks as much as we can really acutely feel the bad breaks, going to come front and center in a couple minutes here when we get to the Malinsky minute. But one more question I've got for you on betting process, and then we'll weave in the hops as well as we hit the home stretch here, Billy. When it comes to your process, I guess, of sharing edges versus capturing edges for yourself, thinking about this week's Bet the Board Monday podcast, no best bet during the pod because you had one lined up and it got hit before listeners would have heard it, hence the Conklin receptions prop getting posted later in the day via Twitter. When things like that can happen, how do you balance providing truly valuable content for an audience versus betting edges for yourself, especially in markets as fluid as props?
One is I'll never force a play. I will never give something out to people that I don't fully endorse and haven't bet myself for a decent amount of money. If I'm putting something out on the Bet the Board podcast, it's because I bet a decent amount of money on it and I feel very confident in it. So if I see something and I go, I want to bet that, and the number moved too much, I'm not going to give that out. That's not fair to anyone. It's not fair to the people. I really care about doing well on that podcast and helping those people out. As for, giving out something on a podcast and making sure you still get the best of it, I will make my intention very clear here. The most important thing for me is to win money betting sports. So I will always make sure that I made a bet that morning on something and it moved too much. and that's why I couldn't give it out. But I was not going to wait. I have to bet that first. I have to have my guys bet it first. That was what was most important to me before giving anything out on a podcast. Because at the end of the day, this is the way I pay my bills. So it's very fitting. It's hard. It's hard to find stuff on a Monday, record it, give it out, and then wait for the recording to be posted and not ruin the market. So a lot of times what we'll try and do is bet it quietly. Try and bet it not on illegal that's going to move it crazy, but try and bet it on a credit shop or a prop builder or something else that's going to keep things a little more mellow. Because the last thing I want to do is record a section for those guys, then immediately bet it. Then the number moves, they get the recording, then they post it, the recording, and the number's already moved 3 yards or 30 cents. It's like, that's not helping anybody. It's not helping anybody. So I don't want to do that. So that's why I waited on that Monday Night Football one, because I knew what I was going to give out and what I was going to record was going to move. So there was no point in me doing that. I had to go to a different direction that night.
And was the one you were going to record, out of curiosity, same player, but yardage to the under?
Long reception.
Same player, close enough. Okay.
Same player, long reception yardage, yes.
So I guess, and there's another very prominent prop bettor who gave out Conklin yardage under.
He got smoked under from a lot of people. Yeah, he got hit under pretty good.
And that just reminds me of one more notion from the logic of sports betting, which is the idea of expanding the attack surface, even when we're not just talking about different markets, sides, totals, derivatives, props, but within a market like props, same player, receptions in a game, receiving yards, reception or receiving plus rushing yards, longest reception, longest rush. A lot of these markets are highly correlated, and if one of them gets hit, not all of the others get hit. So sometimes just keeping in mind options to expand the attack surface can make all the difference. If you don't get down on somebody else's plan A, there can be a very viable plan B, C, and D in play if you're paying enough attention to it.
That's a phenomenal point. And even as a professional and someone who does this for a living, like if someone I know and I really trust sends me some good information or says, hey, someone's hitting this, my first thought isn't to hit the same bet. Because I know I'm not going to get there in time. My first thought is let's go to B and C and D, and then we'll come back around to A. But usually you're spot on with the derivative markets, even if it's a side or total on something, or someone you mentioned some guys early in the program or other professional bettors like a side, and they're also like, I lean to the under. It's like, well, okay, maybe look at the other team's team total under. There's different ways. Go find the best number on something and bet it. If you have a lean one way, or maybe like you said, the number move. Someone's interested in betting Seattle and 3's gone. It's down to 2.5, but the total's been steamed up, and you can get around a key number with their team total. Maybe you look to the over. Maybe you look to total touchdowns over. Those markets vary differently in pricing between all the legals and all the PPHs, the credit shops. I've seen books who have. I remember last year, Kansas City was an offense that kept sputtering and not sputtering, but there would be days that Kansas City on a night game would be like 2.5 touchdowns would be -150 to the over, and another site would have you could arb it. You could come back and take 2.5 under at +160. I mean, so there's some really big price discrepancies in those markets. Just shop around, get as many books as you can, and fire at the best price.
Well, Billy, a little more than an hour in, you've left no doubt you've got the chops when it comes to the props. Also want to make sure to weave the hops into this conversation as we near the home stretch. You let me know before we recorded that you're more of a Corona by the beach guy. And as I told you, I'm a native San Diegan, so that absolutely resonates. I have long maintained on this show that there's a time and place for any drink, no wrong answers. Also have the understanding that you've dabbled with IPA and lived near plenty of great breweries. So how would you describe yourself as a drinker today compared to when you first started tasting beer and other libations?
Yeah, so I don't drink often, especially during football season. I get pretty strict with my diet and my workout schedule and what I put in my body. And I usually am not drinking much during this time. Usually around April or May after college basketball is done is when I'll take more vacations, trips, definitely let loose a little bit. And yeah, I'm not I'm not the IPA guy. I don't think I have the palate for it yet, just because I haven't drank enough. Usually, the people I know who enjoy the IPAs, they kind of went through their phase of going through the Bud Lights, the Coronas, and they kind of graduated to
Sure.
IPA. It's a different palate. And I'll just say I haven't graduated there yet. It's still kind of bitter to me, but there are definitely some I like. And I mentioned we have some great breweries around where I live in upstate New York. And that's what a lot of people do for fun these days. They love to go to breweries, and we were talking before the program. Some of these breweries are starting to put some TVs in there. So if I know some people are going out and there's a TV or two where the game's on, or maybe I can pop in for an hour. I'll give anything a shot, really. But yeah, I'm definitely more of a Corona by the beach type of guy.
Well, in that spirit of being willing to give anything a shot, I'm going to give a shout out to a brewery local to me. Also has some TVs, really big on the Dodgers right now, I'm sure. I want to give a nod to Highland Park Brewery, located in the Chinatown neighborhood of downtown Los Angeles. I've featured them several times on this show, including one of my favorite beers of theirs. It's called Baseball. They call it a sports lager. I kind of put that in air quotes. It's basically the beer that they made envisioning the ideal drinking experience while you're at Dodger Stadium during a sunny, warm day game. And I've had that one featured multiple times on my baseball preview episode with this show. Also had it last week as my show beer when I joined Chicken Dinner with Sammy P. Another Highland Park beer, Timbo Pils. It's basically a West Coast Pilsner, a light-bodied beer, but it has some of the tropical citrusy flavor notes of Mosaic and Citra hops. I mentioned this because last week, the Great American Beer Festival took place. That is essentially the Oscars of craft beer. And Highland Park Brewery won 4 of the most hotly contested categories. They took home the gold medal in Contemporary American Style Lager for baseball, American Style Pale Ale for Timbo, and then 2 more of their beers that won gold medals. One is called Pillow, a hazy double IPA, and one is called Competition for American Style IPA. Think West Coast IPA, more clear, crisp, and light than the hazy style. So, Billy, I know not all of those are necessarily right up your alley, but I think it's phenomenal to see a local brewer of mine that's a favorite just crush it on the national stage. In fact, for good measure, they also won the overall Brewery of the Year award at the Great American Beer Festival. That's kind of akin to taking home Best Picture at the Academy Awards. So just a massive recognition, I think, was well-deserved for a brewery doing massive things. And I'll note that if you or anybody catching this conversation ever finds themselves in LA looking for good beer, look no farther than Highland Park Brewery. And whatever you like to drink, odds are they do it at a world-class level. Also great food, a great space in general, really great staff. Just in short, a great brewery in every possible sense. So it sounds like you've got plenty of good spots in your neck of the woods and wanted to give a shout to perhaps the best spot in my neck of the woods as well.
That's awesome, man. That spot seems like it's a home run right there.
Yeah,
They seem like
absolutely.
they
And
crushed it. I appreciate people. I appreciate excellence, and it seems like that's right up my alley there.
yeah, well, and speaking of excellence in just about every possible sense, Billy, you gave me a perfect transition to the Malinsky Minute to wrap up this conversation. And I've been thinking lately about a notion that Dave shared with me, a phrase that he coined as the Occupational Privilege Tax, basically advising me that the ball bounces in weird ways. Referees and coaches make bad calls, players make mistakes. I think you on Twitter in the past week had a couple posts that reminded me of this. Thursday Night Football between the Seahawks and Niners, referencing, I think it was the Seattle muff punt that wasn't overturned when the ball should have been given back to San Francisco. On Monday night, more of a general reference to the mind-numbing amount of penalties.
Yeah.
And Dave's advice when it came to frustrating stuff like this was to accept it up front, and that way there's no need to react if and when it happens in a way that works against your rooting interest. Wise words, but obviously easier said than done. And personally, I feel like I've been getting tested a lot lately. When it comes to college football, as a USC grad, 3 heartbreaking losses in the last 4 games. I'm getting awfully sick of it, starting to wonder if there's a rock bottom. And then in the NFL, the season has been my best one yet as far as props go, but week 6, my worst week of the season to date. So it's human nature to feel some of those negative outcomes more acutely than the positive ones. Billy, how would you say you approach enjoying the highs without getting too consumed by the inevitable lows in something like betting on sports over time?
Yeah, so I actually made a kind of promise to myself and commitment to myself this year that I was not going to be complaining during Sundays to the guys I work with, or I was not going to be talking about bad beats. It was something because I remember the previous seasons I'd done it a lot, and it doesn't make you feel good. It doesn't make you feel any better. If anything, you're just focusing on more of the negative, and the more you focus on that stuff, the more it seems to happen. And so I really made a concerted effort this year, and it's hard. It is hard when you're watching these games and you see a mind-boggling coaching decision, like you mentioned, a muffed punt's not called, or something just doesn't go your way. That's a 2 or 3% probability, and it happens, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe I just lost this amount of money on this 2% outcome. But the question was like, how do you deal with it? I think you have to make a concerted effort to really promise to yourself that you're going to look at all the good things. And I'm glad we talked about earlier in the program the Montgomery bet that lost, and then the Saquon drop that led me to making a bunch of money on one guy. So one guy dropping a ball and one guy getting sat. So it's really about perspective. You usually aren't focused on all the great things that are happening for you to win a lot of your bets. And so this year, I really took an approach. I told some of my guys, I was like, look, I'm trying to keep things positive. So if you have something negative to say, or I don't want to hear all the negative stuff going on in the game. So let's focus on all the good things that are happening. If there's nothing good happening, we don't got to talk. We don't got to talk about the bad things because it doesn't help you. It really doesn't. You might think you're blowing off steam, but in reality, you're just emulating more of that negative energy. So it's hard. And that's a good little quote by Dave Malinsky there. But it's definitely difficult. It's something that I think you can't just ignore. You have to focus and make a concerted effort at finding the positives during the day when you're betting for a living, or if it's just recreational betting and you're watching a game and you're like, nothing's going my way. Well, take a second look and see what did go your way to get something that won or lost. Or remember that this is not sports betting and gambling is not the only thing going on in life. There's a lot of great other things that you can put your time into, and you can look at it like, hey, things are going to go my way. Things aren't going to go my way. I'm going to make as many great decisions as I can throughout the course of the season. And if I do that, I'm confident I'm going to come out ahead at the end of the day.
Very prudent parting words. I think beyond betting, it's just human nature to look to take credit when things are going well and assign blame when things maybe aren't going so well. But Billy, I want to give you credit for a fantastic conversation this evening. Also want to give credit to the audience. Thank you for tuning in. Best of luck with your Week 7 bets. If you're not doing so already, go ahead and follow Billy on Twitter at Watt_05. Catch his work on the Bet the Board podcast. And one more reminder, he's always on the lookout for reliable accounts. So if you're interested in partnering with an expert, please do feel free to reach out to him. Billy, once again, thank you for the time and insight. This was great. I hope we can do it again before too long. And in the meantime, keep up the great work.
Thank you.